Hi, I'm Anand Rangarajan at the University of Florida, and this is a talk on modeling Strawson's thin subjects using category theory. The hard problem of consciousness is something that has dominated the Tucson series of conferences for over 25 years. Put succinctly, the basic problem here is why should neuronal information processing be accompanied by experience? Or more generally, why should the structure and dynamics at a physical level, why should that lead or entail experience? The mainstream response to this has mainly been one of emergence. My colleagues, for example, in computer science at the University of Florida, seek to reassure themselves that complex information processing systems capable of self-organization will entail experience. And despite evidence to the contrary, they stick to this belief because they don't think that there are any alternatives. Without going too much into all the alternatives, we want to point out that of relevance to this talk are idealism and also the ignorance hypothesis in physicalism, where the basic idea is that you can think of a revamped physicalism which can accommodate experience. The other point we want to make is emergence is almost always confused with holism, and we want to draw a distinction between the two. Okay, so in emergence, which is, we are unpacking it as a complex systems view of the world, the main problem is that the thresholds needed to specify the emergence of consciousness are found wanting. You don't see them anywhere. And this applies to most forms of complex AI systems, living systems, etc. So despite these systems showing emergent properties, there's no real criterion for the emergence of experience. Now, in terms of the alternatives to emergence, as we mentioned before, if you look at idealism, there the basic idea is that you have matter and experience derived from a unitary subject. One of the interesting aspects in this talk is that, in a sense, Strawson's thin subjects take that unitary subject, break it down to many different subjects, which are thin and not thick in the sense of Descartes. The other interesting connection is to holism, and where we already mentioned, we would like to separate discussions of holism from emergence. Okay, so to get started, our slogan is that complex AI systems are not accompanied by experience, which means that we have to revive an age-old distinction between systems thinking and atomistic thinking or particle thinking, which goes back to the 19th century. Now, of course, systems are capable, as we said, of complex information processing. The interesting thing is particles are considered to be highly unified. They're spatiotemporally bounded. They're also natural rather than artifactual. But the connection here is that we want to enable the connection via the idea that experience appears radically unified to us, as if it's happening to one subject. And that form of experience can be connected also to the fact that particles are a highly unified entity compared to complex systems. So that's the connection here that we're going for. And we want to then leverage Strawson's thin subjects as a way of relating momentary subjects to momentary unified particles, where these new particles that we're going to try to posit will be accompanied by experience. Okay, so Strawson's thin subjects, the basic claim is that experience is always accompanied by a subjective experience. Now, this is clearly controversial. This is Strawson's alternative to Cartesian thick subjects. So they are momentary, they are spatiotemporally bounded. And of course, like we mentioned before, it draws upon the intuition that experience feels unitary as in a unified field, because the sense is that it's happening to one subject. Now, of course, the criticism here is that you have a doubling of mysteries. You have experience and subjects of experience. Strawson's response to this is quite interesting. He wants to think of subjects and experience as akin to objects and properties. Just as we have no problem conceiving of objects and properties, he claims we shouldn't have any problem thinking of subjects and experience. The connection to us and why we're calling this the crazy hypothesis is that for us, thin subjects are like particles, but of a very new kind. And we kind of hasten to add that this is not necessarily endorsed by Strawson, obviously. It's just that it's our crazy hypothesis because we are positing that particles are highly unified, momentary, and spatiotemporally bounded, and that therefore thin subjects could be conceived as akin to particles of a new kind. Okay, so they're natural rather than artifactual. The other unusual aspect about particles in the 21st century as opposed to the 19th century is that in sharp contrast to the 19th century, we now think of particles as being formed in quantum field theory via second quantization. This is clearly a departure, and therefore we want to think of subjects of experience as which we posited as new kinds of particles that are accompanied by experience. We want to think of them as self-ons, which are akin to new particles, but now formed in something like quantum field theory via second quantization. Okay, so now in second quantization in quantum field theory is a way by which you have coherent excitations that give rise to particles. We want to think of self-ons as also going through some process like second quantization and coming up with a kind of particle like a self-on from basic fields. The interesting thing, though, is that second quantization is a functor, as in category theory. What this means is that while in quantum field theory, you have this concrete process of second quantization that takes you from fields to particles, if you start thinking of second quantization as a functor, you can start thinking in terms of mapping from physical categories to self-ons using category theory. And that's the meat of this talk. So we are generalizing then from quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, and we're moving to modeling thin subjects using category theory. Okay, so the story so far then is that why is anything accompanied by experience? We think that complex AI systems are not accompanied by experience. And the main point we're trying to make is that we want to think of these thin subjects as akin to new kinds of particles, self-ons, which is we're calling it the crazy hypothesis. But because particles are set up via second quantization in QFT, namely that waves are acting like particles, we want to therefore think of a second quantization-like process, but because it's a functor as in category theory, we want to move to using category theory to model thin subjects or self-ons. So what is category theory? A category, C, is a collection of elements which are called objects. So you have these objects, which are X, Y, and Z. You also have these morphisms where for every pair of objects, you have a morphism that maps from X to Y. The other interesting aspect of category theory is it's the lingua franca of compositionality. For every three objects, X, Y, and Z, if you have a mapping from X to Y, and a mapping from Y to Z, and a mapping from X to Z, then the mapping from X to Z, H, is composed of G and F. And therefore, category theory becomes a very useful way to talk of compositionality, with these morphisms being the glue that relates objects to each other. Okay, so the relevance to the hard problem is that what we want to do in this talk is we want to think of self-ons as objects in a category which are accompanied by experience. And we want to introduce a new ingredient, namely intersubjectivity, as evidence of morphisms. So to prefigure where we're going with this, in a nutshell, we want to think of self-ons as new objects in a category with properties which are akin to experience, with morphisms as being related to intersubjectivity, and that these self-ons are created from a physical category through a second quantization-like process, which would be a functor. And that essentially is the goal of this talk. So what are these functors? Functors relate categories to each other. So if you have a category C and a category C prime, for every object X in C, you have an object f of X in C prime. But in addition to that, for every morphism from X to Y, you have a morphism f of X to f of Y. And the intuition here is that functors map objects and morphisms from one category to another. We've already mentioned that second quantization is a functor. The relevance to the hard problem is that you can think of mapping basic physical objects to cell phones via a functor, but transformations between physical objects at the physical level can now be connected to intersubjective relations between cell phones. And that is something that the language of category theory allows you to do in a very principled manner. How is this done? Let's get started. So we want to think of cell phones as objects in a category S. Morphisms map thin subjects onto each other, but what are these morphisms? Here we want to appeal to intersubjectivity, or the second person, as the grounding intuition for the thinking that thin subjects can be mapped onto each other, or that cell phones can be mapped onto each other via these morphisms. So the basic idea here is that if you have Alice 42, which is a thin subject, essentially a nod to a Cartesian abstraction, Alice, but concretized as Alice 42. If you have a mapping Alice 42 to Bob 108, another thin subject, and a mapping from Bob 108 to Charlie 23, then the mapping from Alice 42 to Charlie 23 is a composition of G and F, as per category theory. We think the grounding intuition for this is really the second person, and that second person interactions set up a graph of thin subjects, where this graph of thin subjects has relations between every pair of, it's a fully connected graph, where for every pair you have morphisms that map thin subjects onto each other, with the intuition being that intersubjectivity gives you the evidence for this. So you can do more. You can also set up a physical category P with objects X and Y and a morphism between X to Y, and then have a functor F that maps X to F of X to Alice and Y to F of Y to Bob, which means that the morphism that takes you from Alice 42 to Bob 108, also that morphism is obtained from the functor F, mapping transformations at the basic level. The interesting thing, though, about these functors is that you can have a reverse mapping from S to P, which is F prime, and that F and F prime do not need to be inverses of each other. So what that means is, if F and F prime are not inverses, then the categories P and S need not be considered to be equivalent. They're not equivalent categories. And if they're not equivalent categories, that would mean that cell phones may have properties over and beyond what you would consider at the physical level, namely that cell phones could enact further constraints. And it's quite natural to think of these further constraints as happening in configuration space and not in phase space. In other words, you can think of the cell phone category giving you relations between objects at the cell phone level, enacting further constraints in configuration space where those constraints are driven by the intersubjective relations between the cell phones. So the importance of configuration space then highlights the connection then back to QFT and to QM. The important point that we want to make here is that even though you can have functors between one category to another, those categories need not be equivalent, as we mentioned. So where's the payoff in that? The payoff here is that when you think of information processing in brains, you think of that as being a convenient shorthand for some very detailed, complex physics that's going on at the physical level of fermions and bosons. It would be next to impossible to talk of fermions and bosons and all their relationships when we talk about brains, because that would simply be crazy, right? I mean, you would essentially not be able to make any progress because you don't have a convenient shorthand or an API to talk about spike trains in the brain at the fermion and boson level. But at no point do you think of this kind of information processing in brains as producing new physics. You think of it as essentially emergent properties of something going on at the physical level. This need not be true when you think of thin subjects. You could have a functor from the physical to cell phones. These categories may not be equivalent. Cell phones can enact constraints which restrict the set of possibilities between them, which you may not see at the physical level. So what this means is, while phase-space dynamics is quite a natural fit for information processing in brains, that may not be true when talking about dynamics between cell phones. And configuration space might actually be a better space because you're working with sets of possibilities rather than function space. So this is important. This also then highlights the three-way relationship between QM, QFT, and category theory. The major advance in QM, arguably, has been that you went from Poisson manifolds and Poisson maps to Hilbert spaces. But that's at a very abstract level. What actually is going on, which makes it very difficult for us to understand what's happening in quantum mechanics, is that you're going from phase space to configuration space, whose importance we highlighted just now, and this weird fact that particles act like waves. In contrast, the major advance in quantum field theory is that you now don't think of particles as being these self-contained entities anymore. You now see them as excitations of quantum fields. And what's actually happening here is you've gone from Hilbert space of a single particle to Fock space or equivalent via second quantization. And with this funny property that waves are now acting like particles, or more correctly, quantum fields act like particles, and that second quantization is a way to go from quantum fields to particles. What you can now do in moving to category theory is that you can generalize second quantization, and rather than talk about cell phones as particles, new kinds of particles, which are formed via second quantization-like process from basic quantum fields, you can now use category theory and simply think of cell phones as enacted via functors from the physical level to the cell phone category level. And you now can model these thin subjects of experience of Strawson as objects in a cell phone category. So that could be an advance of using category theory. We want to point out that you can think of cell phones as objects, intersubjectivity as the morphisms between objects, and experience as the properties of these objects, these cell phone objects. And that could be an advance due to category theory if this can be cashed out. So to conclude, complex AI systems are not accompanied by experience. That's our starting point. The particle thinking from the 19th century is an alternative to systems thinking, and we wanted to highlight this idea that the unity of a particle and its momentariness are similar to the unitary nature of experience, with these thin subjects of experience of Strawson particularly well suited to be thought of as a new kind of particle, cell phones, which are accompanied by experience. So just as thin subjects are always accompanied by experience, you can also have cell phones as being accompanied by experience. We call this the crazy hypothesis for the simple reason that you're thinking of thin subjects as akin to new particles. But because particles are set up via second quantization in quantum field theory, and that second quantization is a functor, as in category theory, you can therefore think of modeling thin subjects using category theory, and we hope that we have made a beginning towards that in this talk. So the basic point here then is that what we are trying to do is we are trying to say that you can have a category of cell phones, which may not be equivalent to the physical as opposed to brain states. You can think of these cell phones as particle-like modeling of thin subjects with the unity of particles related to the unity of thin subjects and the unified field of experience. And that therefore there is a particularly nice fit in moving away from complex systems, which are not holistic and which are like heaps compared to particles, with the nice advance in the 21st century that you can think of these particles as coherent excitations of quantum fields and then generalize to cell phones, with the key being that these cell phones may not be equivalent to the physical category because of the properties of those functors. We want to give a shout out to The Structure of Objects by Catherine Kozlicki and to Maynard Kuhlman's The Ultimate Constituents of the Material World as two books that helped us a lot. Category Theory for the Sciences by David Spivak was also another book that was very useful in this work. I can be contacted at anandar@ufl.edu at the University of Florida. Thank you.
My name is Brian Key, and together with my collaborator, Professor Deborah Brown from the University of Queensland, I'm going to be discussing a framework for assessing the potential for creatures to experience feelings such as pain. And in the process, I'm going to show you how we sidestepped the contentious issue of multiple realizability. Charles Darwin addressed the question about whether animals have feelings in his book in 1872 entitled The Expressions of the Emotions in Man and Animals. He clearly believed that the motor behaviours of an animal were indicative of an internal mental state, in this case the head of a snarling dog representing an aggressive emotion. Behaviour is an indicator of mental state is highly pervasive in the life sciences. It wasn't just biologists who thought behaviours represented emotions. In 1793, David Hume, in his book A Treatise of the Human Nature, Volume 1, remarked, "No truth appears to me more evident than that the beasts are endowed with thought and reason as well as men. The arguments are in this case so obvious that they never escape the most stupid and ignorant." I'm not sure if we'd get away with that these days. He goes on to say, "When, therefore, we see other creatures perform like actions and direct them to like ends, all our principles of reason and probability carry with an invincible force to believe the existence of a like cause." That's something that we now know of as anthropomorphism. The current biological literature and the popular press are currently inundated or littered with examples of various organisms or creatures displaying emotions, be it fruit flies, lobsters, fish, frogs, birds and mammals. Of course, the underlying theme here, as demonstrated by David Anderson and Ralph Alduff in their paper in 2014, is that particular behaviours are indicative of internal mental states. And this is an example of a fruit fly showing an aggressive behaviour and therefore demonstrating an internal mental state of aggression. We argue here that inferring mental states such as feelings and emotions in many species on the basis of their gross motor behaviours is misleading. What I'm going to do is take you through a series of experiments that quite nicely demonstrate this point. The work begins with Sir Charles Sherrington at the turn of the 20th century, who used a series of lesioned experiments in dogs, cats and primates. This is a sagittal section through a cat brain. Sherrington lesioned the brain above the level of the hypothalamus, but below the thalamus of the diencephalon. He then removed all brain tissue anterior to that lesion site, leaving in place only the hypothalamus, the midbrain, the cerebellum, the pons, medulla oblongata, and spinal cord. The effect of removal of the anterior brain, called decerebration, was quite profound in these animals. The animals were unconscious and they adopted a rigid body posture with their forelimbs and hind limbs extended. Sherrington found that if he stimulated the skin of these creatures, there was a remarkable behavioural response. Animals demonstrated what was known as Sham Rage, a behaviour that in an otherwise conscious animal would be indicative of aggression. Animals retracted their lips and tongue, they snapped their jaws, they lowered their heads, they opened their eyelids, their pupils became dilated, they appeared to be angry because they snarled and they had mournful vocalizations. that repeated themselves for a minute or two after the initial stimulation. Clearly, in this case, the gross motor behavior of Sham Rage does not necessarily indicate conscious feelings. The animals were unconscious and they lacked most of the anterior brain. In Sherrington's animals, the hypothalamus was left in place. In the decades since his work, it has been realized that the hypothalamus plays an important part in the rage response. And this is a cat that has been implanted with electrodes in its hypothalamus, and upon electrical stimulation of the hypothalamus demonstrates that the hypothalamus is driving the rage response. Implanting a large electrode into the hypothalamus is quite a crude experiment. It's not possible to actually know how large an area was stimulated by the electrode. Since those experiments, it's now possible to more discreetly activate a small subpopulation of neurons using genetic techniques. In this case, light is used to activate a small subpopulation in a discrete region of the hypothalamus. And this work was conducted by David Anderson and was published in 2011. It's called Optogenetics, and it's using laser light to activate a small subpopulation in the ventrolateral subdivision of the ventromedial hypothalamus, so you can quite accurately target a discrete subpopulation of neurons. The idea is very much the same as with the cat experiment. You have a lead going into the brain. In this case, it's a lead that carries a laser light that activates the set of neurons within that division of the hypothalamus. Mice are very inquisitive, and what you can see in this chamber is a plastic glove that has been blown up. Mice will investigate and interrogate quite calmly the plastic glove. However, if you activate the laser light and turn those neurons on, something quite dramatic happens. The mouse, in this case, aggressively attacks the plastic glove, demonstrating a form of rage. Soon as the laser light is turned off, the behavior goes back to a normal, passive, inquisitive behavior. Given that a small region of the hypothalamus was responsible for aggressive behavior in mice, the question then turned to what was the neural circuit downstream of the hypothalamus that was controlling this behavior? We know it had to be downstream because in Sherrington's animals, the anterior brain had been removed. And in May of this year, it was demonstrated that a very precise circuit beginning from the ventrolateral ventromedial division of the hypothalamus projected to the midbrain to a region called the lateral periaqueductal grey matter. The neurons in that midbrain then controlled the motor neurons responsible for muscle activity about the jaw, so the bite action of the mice during the aggressive attack. So in little over 100 years, we've gone from understanding that some area below the level of the hypothalamus was controlling aggression, to the hypothalamus was controlling aggression, to a small subpopulation of neurons in the hypothalamus was controlling aggression, to the fact that those neurons then projected to the midbrain, to a very precise subpopulation of neurons, and those neurons then controlled motor neurons that were responsible for the gross motor behaviors. There are two very important take-home messages in this talk so far. The first is that gross motor behaviors are not necessarily indicative of conscious feelings. The second point is that structure determines function. That is, a function such as aggression or attack is determined by a particular neural circuit. Now, a challenge to that principle, or a counter argument to that principle, is that different structures in different creatures can produce the same function. This is known as multiple realizability, where multiple structures can produce the same function. If a structure is lacking in one creature, it does not necessarily mean that that function is missing. It could possibly be undertaken by a different structure. In the case of the nervous system, in the case of aggressive behavior, it could be a different neural circuit driving that behavior. I want to maneuver and show that we can circumvent multiple realizability by choosing the right level of abstraction of our function in order to identify a mandatory structure necessary in all cases for that function. The particular example I want to give initially is that of locomotion, bilaterally symmetrical locomotion, and I'll start with the example in humans. Bipedal locomotion in humans relies on alternating muscle programs on the left and right hand side of the body. During the swing phase, in this case, the left leg flexes at the knee and flexes at the hip. The right leg simultaneously extends at both the hip and the knee. This flexion on one side, extension on the opposite side, recurs rhythmically throughout locomotion and is built upon a very simple neural circuit in the spinal cord, demonstrating that structure determines function. On one side we have activity of the knee and hip flexors during the swing phase, and on the opposite side we have inhibition of the same muscles to enable extension. So positive activity on one side, inhibition on the contralateral side, and this occurs over and over again throughout each cycle of the bipedal locomotion in humans. The activity of motor neurons on one side of the body, while the simultaneous inhibition of motor neurons on the contralateral side of the body, is called cross-reciprocal inhibition. And as a side point, it was actually discovered by Charles Sherrington. Every animal study to date that uses left-right symmetrical locomotion employs crossed reciprocal inhibition. So if we choose the correct level of abstraction of a function, so in locomotion, if we choose the inhibition of one side of the body versus the activity on the contralateral side of the body, we find that it is underwritten by a common structural feature. In this case, it is the presence of crossed axons that pass from one side of the body to the other and cause inhibition on one side and activity on the other side. So the take-home message is, if you choose the right, correct level of abstraction, you can find a structure that underwrites that behavior and is absolutely necessary no matter what the creature. What is the correct level of abstraction for feelings? To address this, we need to be on the same page with respect to what are feelings. If you look at the literature, there are a set of common terms used in the description of feelings. They are subjective awareness, an inner awareness, or a conscious awareness. But what are these awarenesses of? It is the awareness of the inner processing of sensory information. You have to realize that the brain has no direct connection with the external environment. The only way it can relate to the external environment is through its inner processing of sensory information. So for us, awareness of that inner processing is absolutely essential for feelings. But if awareness is the correct level of abstraction for feelings, you have to realize that there are different levels of awareness. We realize that there are multiple levels of awareness, and we need to choose the correct level for our abstraction of feelings. Let's give you some examples. At the lowest level, we have an input to a system. That system is a mere detection device, and that detection of that input produces an output. An example would be a thermometer measuring temperature. At the next level of awareness would be an input that is detected, and then that detection is recognized, and that produces an output. An example would be a thermostat, where a temperature is measured. When it reaches a threshold, an output is generated. The third level of awareness is one we're particularly interested in, and that is where we have an input going into information processing, for instance detection and recognition, and that produces an output. But sitting external to this information processing stream is a monitoring device that takes the input and the output from the system and creates a model of the system in order to control the behavior of the system. So this is called a state observer. If we think of it in engineering terms and with respects to a coal-fueled electricity generating plant, it would be like looking at the amount of coal going into the electricity generating plant and the amount of electricity coming out. That state observer would model that and be able to fine-tune the performance of the engineering plant in order to match electricity output with coal input. A further level of awareness occurs when there is an additional monitoring device sitting above, in a hierarchical level, above the first monitoring device. And that monitoring device, in effect, models the behavior of the system with respects to global information. So in this case, we gave you the example of a coal engineering plant. Well, what you would have as a global input would be the weather, the road conditions, the state of the unions and their work behavior. It would be all sorts of information pertinent to the operation of the plant, but not captured under the monitoring device at the first level. And so you have a hierarchical level of monitors in order to capture both local input and global input and control information processing. We propose that the awareness of the inner processing of sensory stimuli, that is feelings, is dependent on the presence of a hierarchical system of monitoring circuits. These circuits are necessary but not sufficient for feelings. That means that any creature that lacks these circuits will be unable to experience feelings such as pain and pleasure. We believe that it is this neural circuitry that should be used to define whether an animal can feel or not, rather than gross motor behaviors. These circuits are made up of a detailed neural architecture, and we can use that neural architecture to decipher whether an animal has the possibility of experiencing pain. We don't have the time to go through the details here, but we have more recently expanded our understanding of the circuitry both in man and in molluscs, and shown that that circuitry of hierarchical levels of monitoring devices are present within the human nervous system, but are absent from the nervous system of creatures such as octopi. I'll finish here by saying the two main take-home points are: behavior is not indicative of internal mental experience, and secondly, structure determines function. In the absence of the correct structure, function cannot be realized.
I will present to you what I call the blueprint for the hard problem of consciousness. I'm a physician, not a philosopher or physicist. I'm a psychiatrist by training and experience with the practical application of phenomenology in the assessment and treatment of psychiatric conditions. This presentation is a brief summary of my book published by Bentham Sciences. I propose a blueprint for the hard problem that is subject-centric, action-based, and not based on panpsychism. This blueprint explains how consciousness can exist and not be measurable. It explains how something can be created out of nothing. I will use the work of several scholars during this presentation. I did not name them in the interest of time. To that end, please look at my book for their references. And what is the hard problem of consciousness? The hard problem is why there is any consciousness at all. Where does it come from? What is the fundamental property that makes consciousness to appear? The hard problem is the origin of qualia. Qualia are the subjective characteristics of experiences. For example, is the subjective experience of greenness elicited by the green color? Where does that come from? How does it happen? Why does it happen? What does a car engine know? To make sure a car engine is not aware, but to know is not the same as to be aware. Gas is poured in the engine chambers, it's ignited, there is an explosion, the pistons move, and the car moves. Human designers molded their knowledge into an engine. From this perspective, the engine is a form of embodied knowledge. Embodied knowledge is in the form of potential states. These potential states must be activated into processes for knowledge to be enacted. These processes must be self-referential and be able to self-model because they can be aware of themselves. Single-celled organisms are the first clear identified subjects and a point of departure. They can be considered the first knowers. There is knowledge embodied at their cellular systems, but they were not designed, they were just happen. Single-celled organisms must process information from the environment to adapt. They will better couple with the environment if they can predict what is going to happen, and that improves fitness. The relationship between expectations or predictions and the incoming information is at the center of this blueprint. The relationship can be projected, or better said, selected by evolution from cellular systems to the human mind. The relationship can be conveyed through neuronal oscillatory activity. The box at the right side of the slide depicts information prediction relationships across a hierarchical system. Lower levels of information prediction become primitives at higher levels. For example, information prediction at the upper right box becomes a primitive renamed information 2. Information 2 is then paired to a level 2 prediction at a higher hierarchical level. Their mismatch can be called predictive error. This model connects the bottom-up and the top-down streams of information. It is at the center of this blueprint. We will see that matches the neurobiology of local neural networks and theories of consciousness, such as the adaptive resonance theory. We will see that the neurobiology supports a model that is based on the generative potential states of top-down predictions. As we saw at the last slide, top-down prediction streams interact with bottom-up information streams. This happens in loops. Loops are cyclical structures. In this case, they are connections within a hierarchical system. From a neurobiological perspective, neuronal oscillations can be considered loops. A strange loop happens when the hierarchy is tangled and the loop returns to its starting point. A strange loop is self-referential. Information prediction can become a strange loop when we find information prediction at both sides of the loop and at the same hierarchical level. Each side information prediction is a subject of the other side. Each side is the predicate of the other side. Each side is treated as a primitive by the other side. About the hidden causes of the self. Phenomenological objects can be seen as inferences. These inferences are inversely mapped out as hidden causes of sensorial information. These inferences are hypotheses periodically updated about hidden causes of bottom-up, internal, and external information streams. Being someone can also be considered an inference. This inference is inversely mapped out as the hidden causes of integrated actions. The subject represents the narrative or scenario that predicts sequences of events. Being someone is action-driven. These actions are generated both at internally and externally oriented brain networks. For example, the default mode network is an internally oriented network. Being someone can be an inference inversely mapped as the hidden causes of the DMN activity. The self is void and the mind its avatar. What's the void? It is someone reconstructed from actions. But there is no one there. It's a form of nothingness. Consciousness is what we do. This is the simple reason that it cannot be measured directly. What's the avatar? The neurological landscape produces and limits what these actions can be. The neurological landscape of actions can be considered the avatar for the reconstructed subject. Because the subject stems from the neurological landscape, the inference mixes the neurological landscape with the experience of being the subject. Please note that this is a strange loop. It is necessary to solve the problem of meaning to solve the origin of subjectivity. Self-awareness and the phenomenological awareness of objects are awareness about something. Information must be decoded to convey meaning. For example, imagine a telegraph sending a transmission. It may convey war or peace. Decoding can only be done in reference to something external to the transmission. Decoding is about something, or, to use a specific word, it is aboutness. Here I use the word aboutness as the same as meaning. Can natural selection be a source of meaning? Yes, and I explain. Natural selection is a source of aboutness. Natural selection has no rules. It simply is, it happens. But there is meta-information. There are rules of the game, despite that no formal rules exist. What is evolution's main meta-rule? To improve the coupling with the environment, to make better predictions. Think again about the projection of the cellular system's embodied knowledge on the human mind. Aboutness is an inference. It is an inference inversely mapped out as the hidden causes of natural selection. Meaning, aboutness and qualia are abstract. Because of that, I will paradoxically treat them as something concrete. Based on this reasoning, I would treat localized forms of consciousness using the same principle. An imaginary number does not exist, but it can be treated as if existing in equations. I would do the same thing. There are flaws on two popular theories of consciousness. The integrated information theory, the IIT, proposes that consciousness comes from integrated information. The theory's concept of integrated information is based on axioms. These axioms come from the phenomenology of conscious experiences. Phenomenological experiences are intrinsically existent. They are structured, specific, unified, irreducible, and unexclusive. These are the origin of the IIT axioms. The theory beautifully mathematizes these axioms into information that is integrated and differentiated. But this is a circular argument. The IIT created axioms from phenomenological descriptions and concluded that the axioms were the cause of the phenomenology itself. The subject was there first. The subject is the premise, not a consequence of the phenomenology of conscious experiences. The OR is a theory based on quantum phenomena. The theory says that something called proto-consciousness emerges from objective quantum reductions. Proto-consciousness is then assembled as human consciousness. I will focus at a single flaw. OR is a bottom-up theory that's not consistent with neurobiology. The brain generates conscious experiences from the interaction between top-down and bottom-up informational streams. Both theories propose a form of panpsychism. In other words, according to them, the universe is conscious either due to the IIT integrated information or the OR proto-consciousness. This blueprint is an alternative to panpsychism. It's not that the universe is conscious, it is that this universe allows consciousness to appear. The existence of the subject allows consciousness to appear. From this perspective, natural selection is intrinsically connected to consciousness. I had all these ideas, but thought that I must match them with neurobiology. I was surprised and should add spooked to find out that the blueprint fits the organization of local networks and the other popular theories of consciousness. I'll briefly review these local networks. Rodent studies of navigation make mice or rats walk in single lines or two-dimensional environments. This little guy is walking a line in a single-dimensional experiment. As they walk, specific hippocampal neuronal activity measurements are done. Their product is a place field of activation with a place cell at its center. Look at ACE neuronal activity at the top graph. The distribution changes as the animal moves. The distribution is the place field. The peak also changes. The peak is the place cell. These experiments are heuristic. They introduce the idea of relative spatial locations in the context of a mental frame of reference. This is an illustration of a place cell and place field in two-dimensional experiments. I'm introducing here the empirical support for the idea of realization of knowledge through the activation of a central neuronal spike within an overall place field activation. This realization is consistent with the information prediction relationship. And a small parenthesis here. Of course, there is more information to be integrated for the awareness of location to happen. For example, there are head direction cells and grid cells integrating the orientation and knowledge of large maze segments. Awareness of location. Motor actions generate cognitive maps. This blueprint affirms that subjective experiences are abstract information that transcend their specific physical origin. These experiences are considered the product of actions. The blueprint is action-based. In two-dimensional mazes, neurons active at crossroads are tied to different routes and emerge as omnidirectional cells. Multiple crossroad episodes, called common junctions, can free neurons of their routes of origin. Omnidirectional assemblies can connect at abstract common junctions. They have a relational origin and can become part of higher-order representations. Here we have higher-order representations emerging from nothing of their own nature. It is something out of nothing. Awareness of time. Interval timing studies assess a period between two stimuli. Interval timing studies are heuristic for the role of the brain oscillatory phases. Oscillations are not only connected by physical locations, they are connected in an abstract manner based on their common oscillatory phases. Brain oscillatory phases predict what will be consciously experienced. The brain actively adjusts the phase of its oscillations. In other words, expectation or prediction are active and adaptive. The brain is constantly adjusting its expectations through oscillatory phasing. Expectation is a hidden form of action. Expectation, not information, is the driving force of awareness generation. Consciousness is something we do. Interoception, the embodiment of one's sense of self. Interoception is the ability of sensing internal physiological conditions. For example, heartbeats, gastric filling, bladder fullness. It is instantiated at the insula. The insula is a cortical region under the temporal and frontal cortices. Information flows from the posterior to the anterior portions of the insula. The activation of the posterior regions corresponds to feelings at specific tissues and locations of the body, such as the bladder. The activation of the anterior regions corresponds to more abstract states and their integration with other informational domains, such as well-being experiences. I'm using here the word abstraction to denote less tissue-specific information. These observations are consistent with consciousness as the realization of information in the context of potential states in a systems hierarchy. We just reviewed that interoceptive information is processed at the insula. It is abstracted as homeostatic significance, emotional salience, hedonic potential, and integrated with cognitive appraisal. I will now briefly review predictive coding. Predictive coding is a generative model contingent on actions. It generates hypotheses to explain a narrative or sequence of events. It actively maps from hidden causes to sensory consequences. It allows the emergence of what is called phenomenal objects. Predictive coding seeks to minimize predictive errors between the sensorial input and models about the cause of these inputs. This is difficult in natural environments. Instead, shortcuts can guide adaptive behaviors. Phenomenal objects can be considered shortcuts. They are heuristic about the environment hidden causes. This is the origin of human cognitive heuristic, the transition from the heuristic of phenomenal objects to idea heuristic. This is a general illustration of the top-down and bottom-up information streams supporting predictive coding. This is a subject-centric view. The neural correlates of consciousness are what the subject is doing. Actions provide the building elements of the subject. Actions and body sensations are the original strange loop of consciousness. Olfactory awareness. Odor objects are phenomenological categories generated by the olfactory system. The olfactory system is a good heuristic model for the realization of information in other cortices. This is because olfactory signals bypass thalamic first-order relay neurons and go directly to the olfactory cortex. This makes the olfactory system easier to study. I'll tell you how olfactory information is abstracted. First, we have the binding of specific odorant molecules to odorant receptors at the olfactory sensory cells at our nose. Then, this information is mapped as structure-based categories based on their odorant receptors binding patterns at the olfactory bulb. Finally, we have the generation of other objects as the information is projected to the primary olfactory cortex and moved from its anterior to posterior regions. The olfactory system processes odorant information into organism-centric encoding. Qualia/phenomenal objects convey adaptive information. Olfactory awareness resembles the insula, qualitative transitions across a hierarchical system. The primary olfactory cortex looks like the hippocampus, focal signaling in the context of widespread activation. This is another slide about olfactory awareness. Look at the left side of the slide. We see the generation of low-dimensional constructs that are adaptive. In this case, pleasantness. In this case, phenomenological constructs match the principal analysis of patterns of neural activation of humans, mice, and flies. Look at the right side. This supports the idea that other objects are synthesized de novo. The case pairwise analysis identifies what odorants have in common. Vector representation shows the creation of new constructs from individual odorant features. Vector representation, but not pairwise distances, corresponded to other objects. These constructs are categories that do not exist in nature. Keep in mind that they transition from structural categories under top-down guidance. It is consistent with the prediction information paradigm. The synthesis of low-dimensional percepts supports the transition from the calculations of predictive coding to phenomenal heuristic. Phenomenal heuristic can transition into human cognitive heuristic. Our next step, the globalization of consciousness. Consciousness starts with local networks processes, but it is fully realized after global ignition and activity integration of local and global actions that occurs by dynamic cross-coupling across hierarchical levels and regions. The global neuronal workspace and the adaptive resonance are two well-accepted theories. They address the globalization of information through horizontal and vertical integration. The GNW is introduced at the left side of this slide. The GNW describes the creation of a global workspace integrating different cortical and subcortical areas. The global workspace is integrated, but the GNW differs from the IIT because consciousness is thought to arise from information sharing rather than from integration per se. At the right side, the ART describes the connection of top-down and bottom-up information flows through dynamic states of resonance. The ART description of how qualia emerges from these networks is quite similar to this blueprint. The empirical support of both theories is consistent with the ideas of this blueprint. However, phenomenal consciousness can occur without the cortex. Some anencephalic children can be considered as having phenomenal consciousness. And predictive coding is possible at the superior colliculus. The superior colliculus is a structure located at the upper brainstem. It integrates sensory information for motor action. Its role at this location in consciousness may explain the phenomenal consciousness in non-human animals. A word about cortical signals of consciousness. Distributed information sharing, long-range feedback, integration, and differentiation are associated with the global activity characteristic of conscious experiences. There is evidence that late extracellular signals captured by EEG and evoked potential studies of conscious experiences are associated with the neural signature of consciousness. Pyramidal cells spike bursts seem to give origin to these late extrapyramidal signals. They may serve as coincidence detectors of top-down and bottom-up streams. Loss of consciousness in anesthesia is not simply the block of bottom-up information. There is evidence that the disruption of higher-order cortical integration may be a primary mechanism. As I said, pyramidal cells integrate top-down and bottom-up signaling. Let's see different ways that this may happen. The disruption of the pyramidal cells dendrite signaling disrupts top-down, bottom-up integration. We can see the pyramidal neuron, its top and bottom layers. The high burst action happens at bottom layer 5. As an example, at the left side of the slide, the suppression of calcium action potential interrupt the interaction. At the right, the suppression of NMDA-related potentials interrupt the interaction. And now, the most important question of the blueprint, the problem of records. Why chocolate tastes like chocolate, not like coconut? I'm not asking if chocolate tastes the same for all of us. I'm asking where are the archives of the rules that match chocolate the food with chocolate the taste? In other words, where are the archives of the rules that match the neuronal patterns triggered by chocolate the food with chocolate the subjective taste? I believe this is an essential question because it's non-metaphysical and not algorithmic compressible. What are the archives of the rules that match objective brain states to subjective experiences? And with this question in mind, I end here. Ask not what physics can do for consciousness, but what consciousness can do for physics. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jeremy Sherman, and no, I'm not wearing any pants. Why would I be wearing pants? Today I'm going to be presenting on what I'm going to call the made harder problem. I've been working with Terence Deacon, you might know the name, for about 23 years now. One of the things I've been doing for him is making these too short to suck introductory videos to his approach to the questions we deal with here at the conference. So what this is going to be is a little film festivalette. I'm just going to show you a couple of these too short to suck videos, a few of them, and then at the end I'll come back for a few comments, and then questions and challenges and controversy. Talk to you soon.
If we're just made of matter, how can we also be conscious, self-aware, able to feel, think, talk, and do all the human things we do? How could matter ever become conscious? Some say it doesn't, that we only think we think, but we're really just matter. Some say that matter has always been conscious, down to quantum mechanics. Some say that the whole universe is conscious, or that something inexplicable explains consciousness, God or a higher power. Still, many say that how matter could ever yield conscious experience is the hard problem that scientists have yet to solve. Yes, but first things first, and the first thing isn't human conscious experience or self-awareness. It's the struggle for existence, striving, trying, which all living beings do, whether they feel it or not. Call it minimal willpower. Plants have it. No feelings, no thoughts, no experience of consciousness, but look at those roots pushing their way through sidewalks in the plant's struggle for its own existence, its will to live. If you can't explain that, good luck explaining the human experience of willpower. An alarming number of researchers skip right over minimal willpower. They assume that plants are just computers. Computers don't have minimal willpower any more than cars do. The hard problem is really the made harder problem because you've left out the crucial middle step between matter and human consciousness, explaining minimal willpower. And matter isn't really where to start either. Nature is. Nature isn't completely reducible to matter. Take a slow-moving stream, matter running smoothly. Increase the flow and the water gets turbulent or forms a whirlpool. Water molecules less likely to flow in some directions than others. No magic and yet a change in likeliness resulting from flows constraining each other, an emergent constraint, a property not of water molecules but their dynamic interaction. Changes in likeliness require material, but they're not a material property. If material is all that exists, then changed likelinesses are either magic or non-existent. Designing computers, we want no changes in likeliness, nothing iffy, zero ambiguity, just huge banks of switches switching each other on and off deterministically. If organisms are just computers, there's no evolution, no responsiveness, no struggle for existence. The struggle for existence is natural but not material, and it's not some new kind of energy either. Same old energy, different likelinesses. Think about it. Water power isn't in the material water molecules, but in how they're channeled, so they're likely to turn a turbine rather than spilling everywhere and settling. The power is in how the energy is constrained. Unconstrained, everything just spills and settles out. To explain unconscious, unfelt willpower, we must explain how a change in likelinesses in chemistry could result in something like a self-regenerative whirlpool, an emergent constraint that channels energy into work that is likely to regenerate the emergent constraint. That would be the beginning of minimal willpower. Above all, first things first, walk before you run. Explain minimal willpower, the struggle for existence, before explaining human conscious experience. Dualism. Two tracks, our material bodies and our consciousness. That's what 17th century philosopher-mathematician René Descartes imagined. He's the guy who said, "I think, therefore I am." Other organisms are just material machines. We humans are that plus. We have consciousness or cognition, a thinking thing, an immaterial something that drives our bodies. Easy to picture, like Wi-Fi, cellular, or Bluetooth driving our phones. Descartes also invented the graph, an idea he had while watching flies flit around his bedroom one morning. He pictured three rulers laid out on two walls and the floor. A mark on each would identify a fly's position. Thus was born analytic geometry, the bridge whereby any material shape is translatable into an equation, and any equation is translatable into a material shape. Not bad for a meditation on flies before breakfast. Descartes called the mind the thinking thing, and the body the 3D thing. He guessed that the thinking thing enters the body through the pineal gland, sort of like an antenna in the middle of your brain, a notion dismissed even in his day. Today, most researchers dismiss Descartes' mind-body dualism as little better than supernatural hocus pocus. But what's their alternative? Usually an equation-based treatment of consciousness. Cognitive scientists observe organisms and distill features of their behavior to equations, algorithms, or even just descriptions of what makes us tick. Basically mental models of mental behavior. They then assume that one could run these models in matter, just like you can translate any equation into material form via Descartes' analytic geometry. But you don't have to. Consciousness is somehow in the researchers' models, their immaterial algorithmic idealizations. Thus, though researchers shun Cartesianism, they're still soaking in it. They're post-Cartesian Cartesians. Is still res extensa, your material hardware, and res cogitans, your immaterial software, for example, equations programmed into your genes or consciousness. Now, Descartes wrote 200 years before scientists discovered the second law of thermodynamics, which comes down to this. With time, everything material degenerates, petering out and falling apart. Not a problem for algorithms since they're immaterial, but it is a problem for us material living beings. The biggest problem, actually. The origins of life is the origins of self-regeneration, countering second law degeneration. We're not going to be able to explain life's self-regeneration with an immaterial algorithmic idealization that runs like software on non-degenerative material mechanisms. And yet somehow, though they won't admit it, cognitive scientists still bank on just such a Cartesian solution. Your genes and consciousness aren't reducible to non-material algorithmic idealizations, translatable by analytic geometry into non-degenerative material mechanisms. We aren't computers, and computers don't struggle to regenerate as we do. In the next video, I'll suggest a truly post-Cartesian solution to the mystery of life, life's struggle for existence as something different from nothing but 3D chemistry. You try. Non-living things don't. What is trying and how did it start? Trying starts with what Darwin called the struggle for existence, which he admitted he couldn't explain and remains unexplained today, which is strange. For all our curiosity about consciousness, free will, and other high-level trying, we still can't explain the simplest trying, every organism's struggle for existence, the work they do on their own behalf. How did life's struggle for existence emerge from nothing but lifeless chemistry? Here is Berkeley scientist Terence Deacon's model for the origins of trying, which he calls an autogen, a self-regenerator, though, as you'll see, it's actually more like a degeneration preventer. An autogen is a bit like a chemical chain reaction that generates chain reaction seeds. It's the synergy of two passive chemical tendencies pitted against each other, chain reaction and crystal formation. An autogen is a chain reaction that proliferates chain reaction molecules, but also molecules that crystallize, forming shells. The shells form in the midst of the chain reaction, encapsulating chain reaction molecules, keeping them together, making it more likely that if shells break, a chain reaction resumes. The autogen alternates between two phases, open chain reaction and closed seed-like dormancy, each tending toward the other, each keeping the other from ending. By themselves, chain reactions eventually fizzle out, unlikely to resume. In the autogen, the shells prevent this by holding enough chain reaction molecules together to restart a chain reaction. By themselves, shells break and shell molecules drift away. In the autogen, the chain reaction replenishes the local supply of shell molecules. We often assume that the struggle for existence is a special kind of thing, energy, or process. For example, a selfish gene, life force, or algorithm. But things, energy, and processes don't struggle for their own existence. They exist passively until they peter out. Where then is the struggle for existence in Deacon's model? not in the molecules, energy, or processes, but in a way two chemical tendencies prevent each other from ending. Open chain reaction growth generates closed protection, which when broken, resume open chain reaction, a work cycle of growth and protection, each preventing the other from ending. Trying starts as the prevention of fizzling out. Your struggle for existence is wildly different from the autogens. What has been preserved continuously over life's eons and across all life forms is the way your chemical tendencies reduce the likeliness of each other petering out. Not a struggling thing, energy, or process, but tendencies pitted against each other such that they reduce each other's likeliness of ending. Is the autogen aware of trying? No. Still, it's working for its own benefit, struggling for its own existence, which even the grandest AI supercomputer doesn't do. Much of your struggle for existence still happens unconsciously and unfelt. Your body's chemical tendencies pitted against each other such that they prevent each other from ending. Every engineering advance of the past 400 years is the product of a brilliant breakthrough modeling method. Not the scientific method's guess and test process. No, something more practical. Call it the engineering method, modeling all behavior as networks of switches and lines. Think of it like train tracks. You've got your lines and your switch boxes. The lines channel energy down narrow, reliable tracks. The switch boxes can be toggles or dials. Either the energy controls the switches and dials, or someone outside the model does, like a lineman. With the engineering method, you start with some phenomena you want to model. You configure a network of lines and switches to represent the phenomena from start to finish. You tweak the network until the model generates the phenomena accurately, and voila, you've got yourself a model. From steam engines to Jacquard looms centuries ago to computing and robotics today, from plumbing to nanotech, from genetics, math, and medicine to business management, logic, and civil engineering, it all relies on the engineering method's line and switch modeling. It has been our technology cornucopia, and we're not half done fulfilling the engineering method's promise. It's easy to assume there's nothing it can't model. And it follows that you're a robot. A machine or computer composed of billions of switches sending energy down narrow, reliable lines to produce your behaviors. Trouble is, you try and machines don't. You've got your goals and emotions that machines don't have, but it's deeper than that. Even plants try to stay alive. They don't think or feel, but they still have willpower, the will to live. They struggle for their own existence. Now, there are plenty of researchers who will tell you you're no different from a machine. They talk all techy, but at heart they're romantic animists, the kind of people who might love a pet rock. No, engineering a robotic model of living behavior isn't the same as explaining living behavior. Obviously, science and engineering are different disciplines with different methods and goals. Engineering is about modeling. Science is about explaining. Today, almost all science and philosophy are practiced as though they were engineering. That's understandable given how brilliant and effective the engineering method is. Still, for explaining living and trying, the engineering model just doesn't cut it. It doesn't compute, and neither do you.
A freezer freezes, a search engine searches. In everyday life we know lots of things by what they do, not by how they do it. That's fine for every day, but it's a problem for science. At present, we know organisms by what they do, not by how they do it. Organisms make effort, all of them, even the simplest, and we don't yet know how. We know lots about biological mechanisms, but still don't know why organisms make effort when non-living things don't. We assume they have something in them that does the efforting. We give that something a name: will, motivation, appetite, drive, desire, whatever. Then we use that name in our explanations, saying, for example, that your motivations cause your effort, even though we don't know what motivations are. No one has ever seen a motivation. Motivation happens in bodies, but when a body dies, the motivations are gone and the body's still there. Not knowing how organisms make effort leaves scientists debating too much like alchemists, working with chemistry without knowing how chemistry works, or like spiritualists, claiming they've explained life by saying we have souls. The life sciences would advance more rigorously if we restored a scientific standard that's been relaxed in dealing with the stubborn mystery of life. Call it originism, explaining properties from their origins in lower-level phenomena.
By Origenism's standards, the lower-level sciences must explain the origin of what the higher-level sciences assume. And until they do, we must admit we're hand-waving more like alchemists or spiritualists than scientists. Origenism is a commitment to building the sciences sequentially. It's not just interdisciplinary, it's sequidisciplinary. Classical physics now explains what chemistry assumes. Chemistry must explain the effort that biology assumes, and then on up, biology explaining what psychology assumes and beyond. Where there's a gap, we need to be honest about it, not patching over it, not pretending that we can fill it with an assumed something we name but can't explain. The devil's in the details. Many theories today gloss the gap between lifeless mechanism and life's effort by smuggling in some assumed efforty thing, however subtly or academically disguised, that carries a theory over the gap. Emergence, complexity, enactivism, selfish genes, quantum consciousness, free energy, all perhaps fine descriptions of phenomena to be explained. None explain why the living make effort when chemistry doesn't. And no, evolutionary theory doesn't explain the origins of effort either. Instead, it assumes effort. Evolution isn't the origin of effort. Rather, effort, organisms competing in their struggle for existence, is the origin of evolution. Effort is something different from nothing but chemistry, yet to be explained. When we've explained it, we'll have put the life and social sciences, and even philosophy, on much firmer footing. Origenism, a commitment to explaining properties rather than assuming them, a sequidisciplinary approach. That's the scientific standard reimposed where it has been relaxed for lack of a chemical explanation for the effort all organisms make on their own behalf, the struggle for existence that is the origins of life.
Okay, to summarize, and I'm going to be reading here, so my eyes will be looking off in the distance. To summarize, Deacon's approach suggests that the hard problem is made harder by assuming that organisms without qualia, plants for example, are mechanisms or machines. The hard problem becomes more tractable if we explain the struggle for existence from its origins in chemistry, and for that the challenge is this. A self-struggle for existence is something different, yet from nothing but physiochemistry. What? And how did it start? Deacon's hunch is that what's different about organisms is that unlike machines, or mechanisms, they prevent their own degeneration, regenerating faster than they would otherwise degenerate. A self-struggle for existence emerges as the prevention of its non-existence, and he's got the autogen, a testable model for how that would start from simple chemistry. By this standard, an organism is a dynamic constraint that channels energy into work that regenerates the dynamic constraint. This follows from a Stu Kaufmann insight. It takes energy to produce dynamic constraints that in turn channel energy. Picture it as threading your way through a crowd of people going every which way, with congestion forming that alters how everyone threads. There are changes in likeliness, pathways opening and closing. The crowd, like any self-organizing system, thins out. It doesn't prevent its own ending any more than a chemical reaction does, a point often overlooked by those who assume self-organization alone explains life. Deacon argues, though, that a synergistic coupling of two self-organizing processes, a chain reaction and crystal formation, autocatalysis and self-assembly, each can become the boundary conditions for the other, each preventing the other from ending, an internalization of aspects of each other's environments, and hence the emergence of interiority, not felt as qualia. You'll notice I haven't gotten to qualia. Well, here's a sketch of how Deacon, a neuroscientist whose first 20 years at Harvard were focused on the evolutionary emergence of human language, thinks about that. All organisms have vegetative selves. It manifests in us as our unconscious, unfelt self-repair. Brains are like a self within a self, another dynamic coupling in which body and brain constrain each other. He suspects that qualia emerges in the strange loop interaction, specifically in hemodynamics, changes in the supply of and demand for energy to the brain in response to somatic and environmental changes. I wrote a book decades ago called Negotiate with Yourself and Win. It's something like that. Having language affords us a third kind of self, though a virtual one. It's not a real self like a brain or a body. So we humans are in effect strange loops of strange loops, both within and in interaction with each other.
But my point here, though, is not to draw conclusions to resolve the hard problem, but to suggest that it's made harder by ignoring the obvious. If you haven't explained the origins of the struggle for existence, good luck explaining the origins of qualia. The hard problem is really the made harder problem. It can sustain a career in performative inquiry, but how we computers got experiences isn't the real question. All right, thank you. And if you've got questions, I'm right here. All right?
Hello, and welcome to my presentation at the 2020 Science of Consciousness Conference. I'm stoked to be here. I'm hoping you're enjoying it so far. What you're seeing here is a meme that I heard Frankish come up with the idea for in a talk he was having with Philip Goff and Richard Brown on Richard Brown's YouTube channel. I got a pretty hearty laugh out of it myself, so I thought I would share it for you to enjoy while I introduce myself. My name is Bryce Bearden. I've got my bachelor's in neuroscience from the University of California, Davis, and my view is that either strong illusionism is true or physicalism is false, with the usual caveat that a Russellian monist physicalism might still be true. And today I'm going to be talking about what exactly it is we mean to refer to when we use the term phenomenal consciousness. I'm going to start by drawing something of a map, by drawing a partition on physicalism and phenomenal realism. In the top left quadrant, we are going to have the views on which physicalism is true and phenomenal consciousness exists. Top right quadrant will have the views on which physicalism is true and phenomenal consciousness doesn't exist. Bottom left quadrant, the views on which physicalism is false and phenomenal consciousness exists. And I've gone ahead and marked off the bottom right quadrant because I don't think anyone is trying to develop a view on which physicalism is false and phenomenal consciousness doesn't exist. Top left quadrant is where you'll find your type B materialisms and your weak illusionism. I'm going to refer to the views within this quadrant collectively as physicalist realism for today. Top right quadrant is where you'll probably have your type A materialism and your strong illusionism. I'm going to refer to these views collectively as strong illusionism today. And the bottom left quadrant, you'll have your idealism, your dualism, and most of your panpsychisms. The location of Russellian monism is going to be sensitive to which formulation of physicalism you're using. Depending on that formulation, it might fall into one or the other quadrant, or it might be located in both. And I'll be referring to the views in the bottom left quadrant as non-physicalism today. I'm going to be utilizing a few points from Dinnett's 2000 paper, Are We Explaining Consciousness Yet? There he said something to the effect that the term qualia is used by philosophers to fill some particular logical role in thought experiments about functionalism. If one defines qualia as what is neither the downstream effects nor the upstream causes of any physical process, then qualia are by definition guaranteed to elude functional analysis. But it's an empty victory, as there is no reason to think that a thing defined as such actually exists. Before we can start analyzing phenomenal consciousness and generating positions on propositions about it, we need some constraint on what it is we're using the term to refer to, whether this be a definition or in lieu of a definition, because consciousness is notoriously difficult to define, some other characterization. We need to take a position on some proposition, which includes the term. Without any such prior constraint, to use the term in an argument or proposition would be to provide the first introduction of the term. Then if one goes on to maintain that that proposition or argument takes on some particular truth value, one has effectively defined the term. One has constrained the thing which that term might be referring to down onto those things for which that argument or proposition takes on that particular truth value. I'm going to use the conceivability argument as an example. And typically going into this argument, one normally has some understanding of what phenomenal consciousness might be, some prior constraint on what the term might refer to. But one could treat the argument as a way to constrain the referent of the term. And this is what that might look like. I'm going to go ahead and offer a paraphrasing of the argument and condense it down into a single proposition. I'll call that proposition P1, and that is the proposition: if actual humans instantiate T1, and T1 here is just going to be a mediary term between the term phenomenal consciousness and what it means, what we mean to refer to by it. So P1 is the proposition: if actual humans instantiate T1, and if physical duplicates of humans who do not instantiate T1 are conceivable, then physicalism is false. And then we're going to have a set. I'm going to call it S1, and that's going to be the set of all possible referents of the term T1 for which P1 is true. Then if we go on to say that phenomenal consciousness is a member of, well, this should say S1 here. If we go on to say that it's a member of the set S1, that is to constrain what it is we may be referring to down onto only those things which are a member of S1. The non-physicalist and the strong illusionist, their uses of the term are consistent with its being a member of the set S1. The strong illusionist will simply maintain that although we are free to define a thing in such a way, there's no reason to believe that such a thing as defined actually exists. But a physicalist realist's use of the term is not consistent with its referent being a member of the set S1. Right. Well, this doesn't show that in general the non-physicalist and the physicalist realist use the term to refer to different things. That's because this is a trivial fact, as when one is using the truth value of a proposition, which includes some term, as the means by which one constrains what it is one's referring to with that term, then what it is for there to be a difference in positions on that proposition is what it is for the two parties to use the term to refer to different things. The non-physicalist doesn't typically go into the conceivability argument or some other arguments about consciousness without some prior constraint. So how might they try to constrain their referent prior to entering some of these arguments? Oftentimes, consciousness will be characterized as having some certain features, which will turn out to be problematic for physicalism. So let's try using that as a constraint. So P2 is the proposition that T2 is intrinsic, ineffable, qualitative, subjective, or private. And then the corresponding set S2 will be the set of all possible referents of T2 for which P2 is true. Right, so the non-physicalist might constrain the referent of the term by maintaining that phenomenal consciousness is a member of the set S2. And then once the non-physicalist has one or more of these features, they can construct an argument against physicalism. Here, the strong illusionist says again that you're free to define a thing in this way, but there's no good reason to think that anything defined as such actually exists. They may say something like, you'll often hear, it may intuitively seem that these features are somewhere instantiated in our world, but in fact they are not and intuition is often not a good indicator of truth. So I'm going to put a pin in this for now. I'm going to get back to a candidate for constraint, which this objection form might not be quite as robust against. But first, I'd like to talk about how the physicalist realist might respond to these problematic features. So the physicalist realist is going to want to maintain that consciousness doesn't have these features. That is, they'll maintain that it's not a member of the set S2. And this is the move made by the weak illusionists. And Frankish, this is where Frankish's response comes in. He says, once you remove these problematic features, there's no distinctive content of the term phenomenal consciousness. There's no remaining phenomenal residue, no way to distinguish the physicalist realist's remaining explanandum, what he calls the diaqualia, from the strong illusionists' explanandum, the zero qualia. He says, the way I read this is something like that use of the term, the use that you get when you reject that it has these features, that use of the term either doesn't refer or it refers to something which is already accounted for by strong illusionism, in which case the view has failed to distinguish itself from strong illusionism. Now, there's a proposition which the physical realist must maintain in order to distinguish itself from the other two views. And because of that, this might serve as a natural constraint for their use of the term. Proposition P3 is the proposition that T3 is neither incompatible with physicalism nor accounted for by strong illusionism. And the corresponding set S3, of course. S3 might be the empty set. And I think what Frankish is saying probably isn't far from saying S3 is the empty set. Why might S3 be the empty set? Well, perhaps because there's no component of the physical narrative which strong illusionism doesn't account for. And if there is something that it doesn't account for, then that something can only be non-physical. If this holds, if S3 is the empty set, then phenomenal consciousness cannot be a member of that set. The physical realist cannot be using the term to refer to what the non-physicalist uses it to refer to, and physical realism can't be correct. While we're on the challenge to the physicalist realist's use of the term, I'm going to talk about the term something that is like, and talk about why I haven't been talking about that term, which is another common term to use to refer to the explanandum in question. And that's because I think there's a very straightforward case to make in the case of something it is like. In his paper in 1974, when Nagel first introduced the term, he said of this thing that we may call this something it is like the subjective character of experience. So he built subjectivity directly into his notion of the something it is like. He went on to pull a form of ineffability out of the notion. So if you're referring to the explanandum as the something it is like, but you're also maintaining that it is neither ineffable nor subjective, then you're not using the phrase to refer to what Nagel used it to refer to, and what I think many other people use it to refer to, in which case there at least remains an onus to provide an account of what it is you are referring to. Okay, getting back to the pin we set just a few moments ago, the non-physicalist has maintained or constrained the referent in that thing in question has some of these problematic features. And the strong illusionist said that one is free to define a term in this way, but there's no good reason to think that anything defined as such actually exists. And I said we're going to talk about another candidate for constraining the proposition is going to be the final candidate I consider today. And that this candidate for constraint might not be quite as subject to this objection form by the strong illusionist. And here's the constraint. The proposition P4 is the proposition that T4 exists is a primary datum. Then the corresponding set S4 will be the set of all possible reference of the term T4 for which P4 is true. And to get an idea of why this objection form by the strong illusionist may not be as robust against this constraint, I would have you look at Chalmers' meta-problem paper, in which he offers a summary of how this dialectic might be going. Okay, if we choose to constrain the term in this way, I think there are going to be some remaining questions. First, it isn't clear, at least to me, whether one is being neutral about any further specification on this thing, the existence of which is a primary datum, or if the only specification being offered is that it's a thing, the existence of which is a primary datum. So I'll compare the two propositions. The first, that there exists something, is a primary datum, and the second, that there exists some ineffable thing, is a primary datum. So this second proposition will constrain the referent a little bit further. It takes the set S4 and it says the things in S4 which are not ineffable, we're not talking about those things. So it's some further constraint, and it's not clear to me if we're providing a constraint only on the fact that the thing's existence is a primary datum, or if there is some further specification. In the case that there is no further specification, it may turn out, I don't know that it does, but it may turn out that there will be some difficulties in demonstrating that a thing constrained as such fills the role that the non-physicalist might want it to fill in some of the arguments against physicalism. However, it might be that primary datumness itself is a feature which is problematic for physicalism. It could turn out that one could somehow pull one of the other problematic features out of primary datumness alone. And that, I think, is what I have time for tonight. I appreciate that you've allotted some of your time this conference to listen to my presentation. My name again is Bryce Bearden. If you have any questions, comments, critiques, contributions, feel free to email me at bdbearden@ucdavis.edu. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Hello, my name is Carlos Acosta, and I'm an independent cognitive scholar. My areas of emphasis are the philosophy of mathematics, the philosophy of logic, and also sense perception. My talk today will be on the evolution of sense perception with an emphasis on how qualia may have emerged. Normally, PowerPoint slides show 3 or 4 lines of text that serve as launching points for the presenter. However, my topic today is so detailed that many of the slides are overflowing with information. So whenever you, the reader, or you, the viewer, come across any of these slides, I urge you to stop, pause the presentation, and read the slide in its entirety, and then continue on. As far as my presentation is concerned, I'll read a few of the lines and then make appropriate comments wherever possible. So let's get started. Phenomenal qualities are embedded abstractions subjectively perceived by a conscious observer. General examples include our 5 senses of vision, taste, touch, hearing, and smell, and specific examples are of qualia include the color purple, the taste of chocolate, and the fragrance of the rose. The question as to whether phenomenal awareness can be empirically understood forms one important facet of Chalmers' hard problem. and it's the position of the study that we cannot know why we experience the essential qualities in the manner that we do unless we first understand how they may have evolved in the very distant past. Now, this paper explores evolutionary foundations of color perception, and in so doing, it proposes that the level where physical reality interfaces with our sensory apparatus, the neural connections that unite the two bring together physiological processes that by nature are acausal and synchronous in nature. These links cumulatively generate phenomenal experience, but the perceptions that they elicit do not match up with any specific material qualities of external stimuli. As such, this article partially endorses Hoffman in 1929, 203, 208, 209, and especially his latest book, 2019, by reiterating that the external world is largely hidden by sensory evaluation. Now, the hard problem of Chalmers is so hard that various scholars have invented new theories to get around the problem, such as the quantum mind hypothesis of Hoffman and the auric model of Hammerhoff and Penrose. And my view, as far as these quantum mind theories are concerned, is that what they do is they replace one hard problem, i.e. Chalmers' hard problem, with another hard problem. No one has ever been able to discuss or provide a detailed example of how the mind is generated through quantum processes. So I feel that those theories are not plausible, and I hereby put forth my own theories based on acausality and synchronicity of Young and Pauli in their book of 1955. So the title of my talk today is Mind, Matter, and Phenomenal Experience, and it consists of 5 sections. The first one is on acausality and synchronicity, and the second section is entitled Applying Pact-Learnable Concepts to the Evolution of Qualia, and it says supporting evidence by Leslie Valiant, W.D. Hamilton, and George C. Williams. The third section is entitled Color Qualia, How Color Qualia First Evolved. The fourth section is entitled Consistency and Uniqueness in Gödel Numbering. And finally, an explanation of how everything comes together is provided by the fifth and last section, the Necker cube. Page 4 of the section on acausality and synchronicity has 4 statements that I believe are true. The first one is qualia are higher order predictive abstractions induced from statistical samplings of probabilistic energy levels and spatial temporal energy distribution patterns of external stimuli, timed to be in sync with the actions and events as they unfold in the perceived present. The second is qualia do not have a direct one-to-one cause and effect physiological correspondence to the objective properties of external stimuli. The third is instead the perceived one-to-one correspondence between external stimuli and internal qualia is the evolutionary end byproduct of hundreds of millions of years of genetic approximation and standardization, along with individualized learned behavior. The fourth of these statements is our conscious sensations of color, sound, taste, touch, and smell are not true or even close representations of the physical properties of external stimuli. Now, given that I believe that these 4 statements are true, we have some questions. And the first one of these is, how can sensory qualia still provide accurate information about the structure and function of external reality without a one-to-one correspondence? And then finally, the last question is, how did qualia first emerge? Now, as I mentioned previously, the hard problem is so hard that other researchers have created other theories to get around the problem, such as Hoffman, 2019, his conscious mind idea, and Hammerhoff and Penrose, 1996, A and B, and with their auric model of consciousness. Now, again, as I mentioned, I feel that these theories simply replace one hard problem with another, and don't actually provide in-depth, detailed description of how the mind may actually work. So, considering that I believe those theories are not or will not be very successful in the long run, I've decided to produce my own idea relating to acausality and synchronicity. And these ideas of acausality and synchronicity was first developed by Carl Gustav Jung. And Jung tried to empirically describe the unpretentious notion that under certain interesting conditions, humans may assign particular kinds of significance to near simultaneous occurrences that are not causally connected, i.e., between which there are no physical links. Now, synchronicity, as coined by Jung, is the occurrence of two or more events that are meaningfully related but not causally connected. Jung believed that these random happenings occur infrequently at the real world level or the macro world level, but that when they do, they are imbued with meaning and pathos by human observers due to their near simultaneous occurrence in time. For Jung, acausal but synchronous events provide a confirmation of the new and meaningful relationship between the individuals and the wider reality. Through this type of relationship, all events, be they emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, or societal, may bear personal significance, i.e. feeling and meaning, to the individual. Now, I would like to add my own personal experience with the idea of acausality and synchronicity. Now, my father passed away a few years ago at the age of 86, and he passed away at his own home around 12 midnight. Now, when the morticians came to pick up his body, we all trooped outside after they had taken him out of the house, and we looked up, and surprisingly, there was a bright glowing ring around the moon. Now, all my family members looked up at the ring, and they were astonished because it looked like a halo. They all simply said, "That's a message from our Father. He's telling us that he's all right, that he's in heaven." Now, obviously, that wasn't the case. The bright rings around the moon occur because of ice crystals high up in the atmosphere reflecting the moonlight. And that had nothing to do with his death. But when we looked up and saw it, the two coincided to such a degree that we felt that there absolutely had to have some kind of meaning. And the meaning that we imbued on the subject matter that he was in heaven and he was showing us by the ring around the moon that he was there. And that, I think, is a good description of Jung's ideas about acausality. Things that have nothing in common, that were not generated through a cause and effect incident, but yet we imbue those two things, two events, with meaning. That's the best way I can describe what Jung meant by acausality and synchronicity. Okay. Now, Wolfgang Pauli suspected that the complementary ideas of acausality and synchronicity, if properly implemented, might provide an empirical framework as to how humans go about constructing a meaningful sensual world from a repeated sampling of external probabilistic stimuli. Pauli was one of the brightest minds of not only his generation, but of the entire 20th century. He believed that a better understanding of how the mind works might be achievable through the application of these complementary ideas to the study of the mind. Now, Pauli did not have all the necessary information at his disposal to construct such a theory, but at this point in the 21st century, we do. However, in order to bring Pauli's insights to fruition, it is necessary to expand Jung's original thesis. Advancing Jung's ideas more along the lines that Pauli suggested, it is proposed that acausal many assumptions, i.e. small holistic predictive algorithms about how nature works, cumulatively impart abstract feeling and meaning to the macro world. Moreover, and again, unlike Jung's original view, this minute systematized events are in constant occurrence at the synaptic level of brain function. Okay. Now, I believe that the initial evolutionary responses to external stimuli were acausal in nature, and by that I mean that the original representational neural responses had nothing to do with the material properties of the incoming stimuli. Some support for this idea comes from the book probably approximately correct by Leslie Valiant. In that book, Valiant states that generalized bottom-up genetic assumptions based on previously accumulated knowledge influence the speed and direction of evolution by regulating the timing and appearance of new mutations. Valiant further states that future generations of genes approximate and fine-tune and standardize the original predictions of how nature works by repeating the process an unknown number of times, but over hundreds of millions of years, but with more precise predictions. Now, in addition, further support may be found in the book, The Selfish Genes by Richard Dawkins. In that book, Dawkins states that genetic changes in behavior are used to test the robustness of new assumptions. If the behavioral and morphological changes are useful to the species, the mutations and their associated behaviors are kept and passed on to future generations along with the genes that initiated them. Now, it is proposed by me that the packed learnable processes of approximation and standardization caused evolution to endow the original acausal neural connections with consistency and uniqueness. Reviewing my notes, I just realized that I have 2 page 7s. Obviously, the second page 7 is number 8. The reader is advised to keep that in mind as he's going through the video. Getting back to my presentation, our sensations and perceptions emerge within an abstract structure of the world similar to that of a game. Both correct and incorrect meta-assumptions of how nature works emerge within this construct. Now together, the 2 types of genetic knowledge, i.e. correct and incorrect, combine to assign feeling and meaning to incoming stimuli. That's my view of the matter. Now, as such, our sensations and perceptions are not close representations of the material essences of incoming stimuli, but rather distinct sensory languages for the abstract expression of the same approximate information concerning physical reality and our immediate relation to it. Incorrect genetic inferences about how nature works normally result in disastrous consequences to an organism and so are not passed on. However, on very rare occasions, wrong genetic assumptions of how nature works turned out to be useful to the species, so they were kept, passed on, and standardized by future generations of genes. Based on pre-existing sensitivity to light intensity from black to white, genes nurtured meta-assumptions that color with complementary properties similar to light intensity existed. Though the bottom-up genetic assumptions that colors exist were incorrect, they nevertheless were useful to the species. So these were kept, passed on, and refined by future generations of genes. As colors evolved, more color gradations and 2 additional color palettes came to be assigned to the narrow band of light intensity of light that humans perceive, and that's between the 400 and 700 nanometers. Now we've arrived at section 4 entitled Consistency and Uniqueness in Gödel Numbering. Now, a mathematician who happens to be a friend of mine stated that if you can't express your ideas or your theories in mathematical terms, then it's most likely incorrect. So with that idea in mind, I would like to switch gears entirely and approach the topic of acausality and synchronicity, and especially the ideas consistency and uniqueness in terms of logic or mathematical ideas. Ordinarily, when translating in language symbols into a number code, no axioms, logical rules of inference, known mathematical lemmas, proofs, or theorems of any kind are utilized. The combinations employed to encode any language statement into a number code are completely arbitrary. There are infinitely many language symbol number permutations by which the same language statement can be represented numerically. Now, to standardize a coding scheme and achieve conditional consistency and uniqueness, Gödel began by utilizing a bijective table. Within the table, each symbol of the language has only one corresponding natural number, and thus each translation is entirely accounted for by the permutations in the table. In their 1958 book, Gödel's Proof, by Ernest Nagel and James Newman, they provide the following table. Now, I would like to point out that there's actually no rhyme or reason why the letters, the language symbols, and the numbers are combined in the way they are. They actually are completely arbitrary, but by placing them in the table, Gödel has generated conditional consistency. When creating a Gödel number, all one needs to do is assign a distinct natural number to each symbol in the language. Then write the assigned numbers as exponents of primes in their sequential order. What we need to do is allocate the same number of individual primes as there are language symbols, and then multiply the products of the sequential primes, each of which is individually raised to the power of the natural number that corresponds to the respective language symbol. The fundamental theorem of arithmetic stipulates that any number can be divided into its prime factors and their associated exponents in only one way. Therefore, it is always possible to recover a unique language statement from its Gödel number regardless of the number of symbols that were originally encoded. Gödel's numbering method guarantees consistency and uniqueness of the encoded language statements, even though the language symbol number permutations are completely arbitrary. Statement 3 above is analogous to the proposed evolved consistency and uniqueness between sensory neural connections and external stimuli, even though the initial associations were acausal. Nagel and Newman provide the following analysis of highly significant but underappreciated aspect of Gödel numbering. The language statement, the initial symbol of the following formula is a tilde, is incorrect. Although the formula says 0 does not equal 0 is false, Nagel and Newman's meta-mathematical statement about it is true. The original language statement translates into the statement about the formula's Gödel number. That is to say that the first exponent is 1. For example, the Gödel sequence of the formula 0 does not equal 0 is the following: 2 to the first, 3 to the eighth, 5 to the sixth, 7 to the fifth, 11 to the sixth, 13 to the ninth. In that number series, in that prime number series, the first even term is raised to the power of 1. Therefore, 1 is the first exponent in the sequence. In regard to the previous analysis, Nagel and Newman wrote, "This exemplifies a very general and deep insight that lies at the heart of Gödel's discovery. Typographical properties of long chains of symbols can be talked about in an indirect but perfectly accurate manner by instead talking about the properties of prime factorizations of large numbers. So long as the original acausal connections between external stimuli and our internal neural physiology evolved to be consistent and unique, our sensory systems may generate incorrect meta-assumptions about the structure and function of reality, and they may also generate meta-predictions concerning external existence that are true. Both types of meta-inferences may be generated without a direct one-to-one physical correspondence, provided that the higher-order predictions are expressed in terms of a unique pre-existing lower-level process. If this thesis is true, it would eliminate the need to invoke the quantum mind hypothesis of Hoffman or the Auric model of Hammerhoff and Penrose, or even possibly the integrated information theory of Tony 2008 and 2012. These theories were brought about to get around the phenomenal awareness issues of the hard problem. Any credible theory of mind formation must provide testable explanations for how the mind works. Accordingly, my emergent, acausal, and synchronous theory of conscious experience correctly describes the following. The external world is learnable. It has spatial temporal properties that form an infinite number of predictable holistic patterns and displays consistent cause and effect relations. Humans have evolved to perceive these immutable spatial temporal properties, repeatable patterns, and consistent causal relations by genetically internalizing them and representing them in our mental models of reality. In addition to the large heuristics that Gödel describes, there are numerous other lower-level sets of smaller and more basic assumptions of how nature works that our brains use to impart renormalized feeling and meaning to our perceptions. The brain weighs color, lighting, and shading meta-assumptions very heavily when predicting the exact spatial orientation of external objects. In the case of the necrocube, these more precise abstract layers of information are missing. So the brain falls back on a lower-order heuristic composed of a set of many predictions dealing with visual perspective. Based on the immense statistical regularity commonly expressed in nature, through genetics and experience, the brain generates several small meta-predictions of how nature works and of our immediate relation to it. These predictions cumulatively coalesce into the emergent general assumption that when viewing any rectangle or cube, only one complete angular vertex is nearest to the observer at any given moment. A complete angular vertex is defined as one in which all three sides and the three inscribed angles of any rectangle, box, or solid cube are fully visible to the observer. As stated above, under normal circumstances, our brains assume that only one complete angular vertex is in front of an observer at any moment in time. However, all corners of a necrocube form complete angular vertices, and so are evident to an observer. So because body movement alters from one feedback cycle to the next, and since there are no overriding color, light, and shadow geometric assumptions to fine-tune and affix its exact spatial orientation, whenever eyes move and then alight on a different corner of the cube, our brains reconfigure its previous conscious representation in order to fit the most dominant set of predictive meta-assumptions in operation. Therefore, for any observer of a necrocube, there are 8 possible spatial orientations that can be expressed and that may be consciously experienced. And for any typical observer, their conscious awareness will oscillate back and forth between several of these.
Hi, welcome to Tucson. My name is Eric Sabin. I'm the author of Consciousness is Coherence. On the cover is an illustration of field geometry. And that's what consciousness is. That's my claim. And so the problem is now solved. Not really, because what the heck is a field? What the heck are fields made out of? That's kind of a weird question to ask. And if you ask that question to a physicalist, the physicalist would likely say something like, are you kidding? Fields aren't made of anything. They're constructs. They're mathematical constructs. And my response is, if you gravity can't be a construct. I mean, come on. So anyway, the word construct is vital to understand. It is used by both physicalists and idealists. What it means is that it is a subset, a construct of a particular ontological category. They dismiss it as being such. They say, oh, that's just a subset of an ontological category. Oh, that's just a construct. And the categories being used here are physical and non-physical. I don't like those categories. They serve only to confuse understanding, ontological understanding, because their relationship is undefined. Anyone can just show up and say that the physical is a subset of the non-physical, or vice versa. And basically, if you think about it, that's what ontology is. It's you're trying to find the relationship between categories. So if they're undefined, as in the case with physical and non-physical, then that just makes the entire discussion useless philosophy. And anyway, the use of subsets, ontological subsets, lead to infinite regression. So for example, what's that made of? Particles. Okay, what are particles made of? Smaller particles, and so on and so forth. For infinity. So there's a solution to this. It's been around a while. It's been around a long time. You've all heard of those philosophical, those thought experiments regarding the color red, where you can't describe the color red. Well, it's a good argument against both physicalists and idealists. Ask them to describe the color red. You can't do it. You can't do it. You can't describe the color red. Why can't you describe the color red? Because the color red is a description, and you can't describe a description. And what this means is that we've now identified two ontological categories that are separate, and they can't be subsets of each other. Things that can be described and things that can't be described. And also keep in mind that these categories, you can't have one without the other. So basically, if you ask a physicalist or idealist what something is made out of, and that thing you're asking them about is something that's indescribable, their answer will always be, it's a construct. But it's not a construct. It is indescribable. It's in its own ontological category. So an interesting one is, what's geometry made of? You want to answer that question by saying, well, geometry isn't made out of anything, it's a construct. But things have shapes, don't they? Things have lengths, don't they? And those aren't constructs. So now, for the fun part of my speech. Boring part of the speech is over. Now for the fun part of my speech, where I get to talk about magnets. So, you've all played with magnets before, right? In kindergarten, they probably told you about magnets and how they attract and repel. Well, wait a minute. Magnets don't really attract and repel. If you hold two magnets together, if you disalign magnets and you hold them together with your hands, it kind of feels like they repel. But your hands are like an outside force acting on the magnets that the magnetism has to contend with. And really the magnets are not pushing apart. What they're trying to do is rotate to align themselves and go together. So there's some kind of mysterious force that makes magnets want to orient themselves together and go together. So how are magnets made? Well, first you have to understand that every particle has characteristics of magnetism. Every particle has a magnetic field. So if you have a chunk of material that's not a magnet, it's not magnetized, it's still made up of particles that are like little magnets. So what they do is they take this chunk of material that's not a magnet and they make it so that all these little parts align together. And when they align together, they combine together in a way to create a single greater magnetic field. And this form of combination or orchestration is called coherence. They have a name for it. So the magnetism isn't created. It doesn't emerge out of nothing magically. It was always there to begin with. Also, there is no change to the quantity of material, but there is a change to the quantity of coherence. Each magnet has a north and a south pole, and they can't really be separated, even if you wanted to separate them. It's like the north and the south pole are part of a whole field geometry, and if you broke a magnet into two pieces, all you'd get is two magnets. If you put two magnets together, what you have is a single magnet. It's really cool how it works. And even though you have a single magnet, both of the magnets that are together have their own north and south pole. Just like every particle inside the magnet has its own north and south pole. But collectively, all together, they cohere to form a single greater magnetic field, and that single greater magnetic field has its own north and south pole. And this single greater magnetic field continues to exist as you pull the magnets apart. And theoretically, what they say is that it just continues to exist no matter how far apart the magnets are, as if a magnetic field is it spans an infinite amount of space, but it's just a mathematical construct. So basically, what this means is that magnetic fields are self-similar and hierarchical. So you might be asking, Eric, why are you talking about magnets? Magnetism is one of those physical forces. Whereas consciousness, see, this is a consciousness conference. We're supposed to talk about non-physical things. Isn't it a testable hypothesis that the brain attracts particles? Yeah. And, well, I mean, the brain does attract particles. What do you think is happening when a bunch of sweet particles bind to your sweet receptors? You experience sweetness. And then information travels through your brain in the form of chemical reactions. Well, guess what? Reactions, information, and binding are all words used in place of an ontological understanding not only of consciousness, but of the physical forces in play. They don't even know what binding is. So now for my position. My position is that there's no duality between the so-called physical and non-physical. So basically, I'm a proponent of monism. Okay, so the physical, so-called physical characteristics are the same as non-physical characteristics. They're just characteristics. Consciousness is coherence. But I wouldn't say that consciousness of the brain is magnetism per se, because the materials of the brain are not materials used in making magnets. Every material has different characteristics, kind of. Magnets made with different materials have different characteristics. For example, if you wanted to make an electromagnet as opposed to a permanent magnet, you might choose a material with high permeability and low coercivity. Likewise, if you want to make a good sugar substitute, you would choose a material that has a high level of sweetness. I think that sweetness might be a kind of magnetism of a different field geometry. So now it's time for me to try to explain why fields combine and why fields are self-similar and hierarchical and are thought of as being infinite, because I cannot simply use the word coherence in place of an explanation. Okay, so first of all, let me teach you about projection. Projection is the creation of an image using a light source. An example is the sun projecting an image of you onto the ground as a shadow. But your shadow isn't 3D like you are, it's 2D. And that's the main point of projection in the mathematical sense, because projection is also a mathematical construct. The purpose, the process of projection is a process of transformation of an object of one dimension, a higher dimension, to a lower dimension. For example, 3D to 2D. There are different kinds of projection, and it depends on where the light source is in relation to the object. The kind of projection I want to talk about is called stereographic projection, where the light source is touching the object. Once the light source touches the object, some weird stuff happens. Infinity, or the illusion of infinity, is projected. Your shadow becomes infinitely wide. You can see this yourself if you bring a flashlight closer to your hand. Your shadow gets bigger and bigger. The image is increasingly distorted or stretched the further from the center you look towards infinity. This happens because the light source displaces a point on the object itself, essentially turning a closed geometry into an open geometry. Now, imagine a 3D globe being projected and transformed into a 2D circle. It's a sphere. Making up this sphere is a series of lines that are like latitude and longitude lines that form a grid-like pattern. And these lines intersect at 90 degrees to each other. In relation to the North and South Pole, these lines are angled at 0 degrees and at 90 degrees. The stereographically projected image of this globe, which is 2D, closely resembles the effects of a magnetic field on iron filings sprinkled over a sheet of paper. The iron filings are showing us a 2D slice of magnetic field geometry because the magnetic field geometry, magnetic field is 3D. Therefore, it is reasonable to wonder if the 3D shape of a magnetic field is due to the stereographic projection of a fourth dimensional sphere, a 4D sphere, also known as a hypersphere.
There are multiple models of stereographic projection of a hypersphere. My question is, does one of these models accurately represent field geometry?
There's a range of possible angles a set of lines can take around the sphere. It doesn't have to be just 0 degrees and just 90 degrees. It can actually be between 0 and 90 degrees. And when they're between 0 and 90 degrees, it looks like they're going diagonally. They're kind of like curled around the sphere. And they're called loxodromes. They're like a serpent coiled around a cosmic egg. That's like in reference to a metaphysical concept. When loxodromes are stereographically projected, they create logarithmic spirals. So you see all the time people pointing out spiral patterns found in nature, such as the golden spiral. Everyone's talking about the golden spiral this, golden spiral that. The golden spiral is just one of many kinds of spirals, and all these spirals differ by their angle or bearing. The angles of logarithmic, well, by the way, the angle or bearing is due to the angle of the loxodrome on this sphere. So the angles of logarithmic spirals found in nature can be measured. These geometries can be listed and categorized. Possible correlations between angles and materials can be determined. Many biological structures bear resemblance to stereographic projection geometry, including sweet receptors and microtubules during the process of mitosis. Non-physical characteristics such as sweetness may be able to be categorized in terms of geometry, in terms of an angle from 0 to 90 degrees. And this is a technical task, not a lofty philosophical one. But it can never happen as long as the dominant assumption in academia is that geometry, sweetness, and magnetism are all just constructs that don't deserve an explanation. I still haven't really explained why fields cohere. Well, my best understanding so far is that if monism is true, then it also may be accurate to say that there is a kind of explicate order which is a stereographic projection of and a kind of holographic image of an implicate order, meaning that in true reality there is no real distinction between objects, no real movement, and no real time.
Okay, hello, my name is Ben Meyer. I am currently an independent scholar and a therapist. And I'm going to be talking about a paper that I wrote a couple years ago in a philosophy of mind class relating to consciousness. The paper is called The Lure of Consciousness. I've got here some information about it we can consider. A little bit about myself. I just mentioned, if you have any questions, I'm going to leave my information at the end. What we're going to be looking at here are two different books. One is called Mind and Life, Biology, Phenomenology, and the Sciences of Mind, written by Evan Thompson. The other, How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain, written by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And based on these couple books, we're going to see if we can inform our view of consciousness. Other helpful contributors are going to be John Pertevi, a philosophy professor at Louisiana State, Thomas Nagel, who wrote an interesting article in 1974 called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? We're also going to look at the term panpsychism to see how understanding panpsychism might help inform our views of consciousness. And then finally, a paper by Bryce, who is a philosophy professor at Georgetown. First thing I'm going to talk about is trying to ground the brain and the mind. The classical view, which is also called cognitivism, sort of views our mind as capable of taking in information from the environment. It sort of does something with it inside, and then we can give information out, sort of like a computer. And what we're going to talk about as an alternative is what's called the 4EA approach, which looks at the mind as embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended in our environment, which is a little bit more detail than sort of just taking in information. It talks about sort of how we are sort of reliant on our environment as people, and in the same way we use our brain in tandem with the environment, actually. And then how can consciousness be better understood under these paradigms? Also, not to forget here the idea of affect within the 4EA approach, which Lisa Feldman Barrett will help us spell out. So an analogy here is with the term evolution. Initially, the term evolution sort of was revolutionarily, historically, and it sort of went up against the idea of creationism. However, when we talk about evolution now, we're also talking about fitness, we're talking about natural selection, we're talking about environmental pressures on populations and those patterns over time. And so evolution has almost become a lot less specific over time and much more general. So the idea here is that consciousness may be the same type of term in that sense. And just as evidence of that, what we're looking at with consciousness may include things like attention, awareness, focus, memory, social influence, brain and mind processes, among them some environmental data like qualia. How do all those things fit together? It's fairly complicated, obviously, but what we're looking for here may actually be not able to fit into a specific place and not materially definable or exacting or universalizable is another word. And Nietzsche had a quote about that. He said, explanation is already description. Nagel's paper on his bat in 1974 sort of laid the groundwork for having a distinction between the third-person top-down perspective and the bottom-up subjective perspective. Questioning about what it might be like to be a bat, it sort of seems to be a very hard question to answer because we're really not familiar with what that's like whatsoever. So what we're talking about here as it relates to consciousness, at least of a bat, seems to be out of question. And Thompson here notes consciousness as constitutive does not equal causal. The interiority of life is the interiority of selfhood and self-making, which is a precursor to the interiority of consciousness. So what Thompson is saying here is our subjective view actually informs our objective view. So we can't sort of necessarily have only an objective view because that's limiting. Consciousness then is a feature of sense-making, not a unique standalone feature to be understood acting as an independent agent or starting point. Further, when it comes to Evan Thompson in his book, he notes Cartesian dualism had long ago created an explanatory gap between mind and matter, consciousness and nature. Cognitivism, far from closing that gap, perpetuated it in a materialist form by opening a new gap between subpersonal computational cognition and subjective mental phenomena. So here we're dealing with sort of that same played out sort of distinct categorization of consciousness, which may be limiting. And in that case, it's not a puzzle to be solved, but a phenomena, not unlike other animals or plants, although unique to human beings because of our ability to have the quality itself and to be able to reflect on it. And as a part of sense-making, what we're looking at here is that the mind is within the purview of life to that extent and a placeholder. So not to go down a rabbit hole of debate here of sort of language or logic or materialism or idealism, but let's consider panpsychism here to help us understand some of what we're looking at. So panpsychism is the view that mentality is fundamental and ubiquitous in the natural world. This view has a long and venerable history in philosophical traditions of both East and West and has recently enjoyed a revival in analytic philosophy. For its proponents, panpsychism offers an attractive middle way between physicalism on the one hand and dualism on the other. The worry with dualism, the view that mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of things, is that it leaves us with a radically disunified picture of nature and the deep difficulty of understanding how mind and brain interact. And whilst physicalism offers a simple and unified vision of the world, this is arguably at the cost of being unable to give a satisfactory account of the emergence of human and animal consciousness. Panpsychism, strange as it may sound on first hearing, promises a satisfying account of the human mind within this unified conception of nature. So recognizing here that there are some limitations between sort of this top-down view, because what we're doing is separating essentially the self from its environment as distinct categories. The mind and the body that way are also separate. And here again, a materialist versus an idealist conception would be distinct in that same vein. So how can we put consciousness in any of these categories? And the question is it everywhere? And also, what do we mean by it? Few problems. Distinction here between panpsychism and consciousness. Nagel states, if mental processes are physical processes, then there is something it is like intrinsically to undergo certain physical processes. What it is for such a thing to be the case remains a mystery. So here we're sort of still kicking around these same older ideas. This shows that the inescapability of not acknowledging the subjective character of experience from a first-person perspective, although it still does not allow us to say what another says from that first-person experience. So here we've got this distinction of first-person experience being important, yet not really sure where to put it. Panpsychism allows for pre-consciousness by other things, and again, we're going to explore that a bit, while yet distinct from our self-consciousness. And so distinct, meaning it could be a form of, our consciousness could be a form of panpsychism, but panpsychism sort of includes a broader category of what it might be to be conscious for other things, a variation of that sort of consciousness then. And perhaps that's what's going on with bats. And so the question is, how do we put all this together? So if we have consciousness as sense-making, that equals the mind and life idea as proposed by Thomson, explained by the 4EA hypothesis and mind and life continuity, having evolved from what Thomson points out very nicely as his term autopoiesis, which is the self-organizing capability that through evolution we have sort of took on and has become all of our different sort of systems, including our ability to reflect and be conscious. Panpsychism as a bottom-up subjective experience is then reorganized as such by human beings' capacity for sense-making. So we can sort of infer what it might mean to be a bat or to be a tree, but we don't have that first-person experience to know exactly what that might be like. So there's obviously a gap there. What might be said about insects' behavior is another sort of question I think we can explore, and it sort of helps fill in some of these blanks. We'll get to that eventually. First, though, let's look at Lisa Feldman Barrett and her idea of the subjective. What she talks about is that emotion and affect are the building blocks of experience. Rather than taking the traditional emotional fingerprint view of top-down or third-person perspectival research, using these concepts, she infers commonality and difference across all populations of people, thereby taking a biological, an active, embodied approach to cognition. Initially, Feldman Barrett discusses pleasure and disgust as sort of universal terms when it comes to making sense of things, and how some of these emotions might then give way to more complicated aspects, such as what we have now. She also considers a secondary feature of how calm or agitated one feels called arousal, and having positive or negative valence to objects in our environment is nothing new, but taking these two key features as what gives range to the entire emotional experience and cognition on top of that would be. Further, again, trying to ground cognition, Feldman Barrett uses the term interoception to talk about the experiences that we have within our bodies. She calls this ongoing process interoception and a navigation of one's, quote, body budget. Moment-to-moment interoception infuses us with affect, which we then use as evidence about the world, and we then use as sort of the basis for our cognition, our reason, our abstract ability to conceptualize, and consciousness itself. What Feldman Barrett is saying is that we have an ongoing process of circularity that informs our affective state, our inner body budget, and our actions and reactions, giving us actual emotion, and also feeding these cognitive processes. The 4EA versus cognitivism, and also versus universalism. Like ruling out an emotional fingerprint, Feldman Barrett insists this process underneath our perceptual experiencing informs our thinking and feelings and actions, all the while attempting to manage our inner experience in tandem with its affective realizations. At no time would Feldman Barrett say that this type of process is informed from a top-down objective place, rather that the concept is a result of our affective states, which then questions the details of the information coming from this embodied interaction with our environment. So consciousness here would just sort of be an elaboration on that emotional experience as its foundation. So against the use of consciousness as a shared concept or universally known, just like an emotional fingerprint is not universal, rather than one universal concept of anger existing, there could be any combination of sensations and thoughts that through one's effective interoception give a particular brain mapping pattern, such that it can be seen or measured. It just cannot be measured and then explained back to include other people's experiences. In other words, it would not be possible to map these experiences as happening based on top-down observations or similarities. Rather, what gives light to these experiences is first person all the way. So, in other words here, by looking at these first person and subjective experiences as a phenomenologically unique experience, they elude the ability for us to map them. Okay, moving on. So what do we have? Processualism, panpsychism, consciousness. Feldman Barrett explains it as anger does not live inside a person. Further, she states variation, not uniformity, is the norm. In other words, there is no universalizable concept of emotion, and finding them will not give a blueprint for others who have these emotions because they are built from within a person's own personal interactions with the world and within their culture and with their brain. Additionally, here, let's look at John Protevi's ideas when it comes to these debates, questions. Protevi describes Thomson as a radical processualist, rejecting the Cartesian extended substance picture of nature in favor of everything is process all the way down and all the way up. Processes are irreducibly relational. There is no base level of elementary entities to serve as the ultimate emergency base on which to ground everything. With the co-extension of mind and life, we come to the question by the panpsychist, is mind and life too restrictive with its definition of mind? If there's no mind prior to life, then mind must radically emerge with life. But with the process view, there's no radical emergence from a baseline of elementary particles. Nothing out there, apart from what can be imagined or conceived by humans as part of their sense-making qualities, which have evolved as a portion of the mind and life continuity, in other words. Thomson quotes Merleau-Ponty. Use objects and cultural objects would not be what they are if the activity which brings about their appearance did not also have as its meaning to reject and surpass them. This self-surpassing mentality is a structural precondition for cultural forms in the first place. This means our terminology as a tool is limited when it comes to addressing these concepts. In a manner, in building the case for the answer to the question of panpsychism or processualism, one can say in part, neither would sufficiently lead to the possibilities of which we are not yet aware. Taken together, however, both could ground consciousness in a sense-making mind and life phenomenology and within Barrett's emotional affect, unique to each individual and without a universalizable fingerprint. Protevi says the key for us is to see that adaptivity requires a dynamic emergent self, unifying a multiplicity of serial processes. We might say that autopoiesis entails synchronic emergence, where adaptivity entails diachronic emergence. And a concern which I echo is we have to worry that a definition of mind as mere information transfer involved in self-organization is so broad as to be meaningless. Feldman Barrett, in conclusion, would say this speculation is part of our attempt to make universal something which escapes it. Thomson would acknowledge the processes at work here. However, he may be leery of going too far with cognition, which misses the integral processes that instantiate it. Additional conclusions, panpsychism and consciousness then may be evident of the overstated computational mind-body classic cognitivism back at work once again, attempting to make general and objective that which is not capable of such determination. In other words, we can consciously abstract the potential for processes where we may never need them and beyond what we can determine, or we can look at the shared dynamics that inform these views primarily. Further questions here can be brought about through the article by Bryce Huebner called Kinds of Collective Behavior and the Possibility of Group Minds. The idea there is that there are questions about a locust, such that we're not really sure if the locusts have a mind. They sort of act like they do when they're in a swarm. They can sort of have sort of really unique behaviors. Might this be the beginning of consciousness of locusts? What if the locusts were organized hierarchically? Hume takes the position that since they're not, they don't have a mind. But perhaps using the panpsychist point of view, this could be sort of the emergence of something like that. And I think that helps sort of illustrate some of the commonalities and differences between us and locusts. And as has been sort of pointed out by Nagel, within all these sort of different variations of how we might sort of contextualize some of these elements. So beyond that, I've got some references here for consideration of what I used in my paper and for further reading. And I've got my contact information here included as well, along with some additional readings that I think can be helpful to further tease out some of these aspects. And thank you very much for giving me a listen.